Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Lois Lembo, who is the daughter of Frank Lembo, the subject of a combat engineer with Patton's Army. Lois took her MBA at Rhode Island. She worked as a defense consultant doing naval wargaming, among other things, and is in the process currently of writing what she calls the prequel, the experiences of her father and his fellow soldiers in training. Tonight's speaker will be her husband, Leon Reed, who, as a congressional aide, had a hand in the Defense Production Act, which my engineer son just loves. And he also was on the worked for the banking committee and did reports on lessons learned from the industrial mobilization for World War II, among other fascinating topics. He finished up his career as a history teacher in Virginia, in the area now being beset by wokeness. He's currently the editor of the magazines published by the 80th Division Veterans Association and the Battle of the Bulge Association, among other things, and he's got 7 books to his credit on the Civil War, which is his main war, Revolution, and World War II. And, there we are. So, Leon, the floor is yours.
It's our pleasure to be here. I said to the group at lunch today, we've spoken to a few World War II roundtables or at museums, Civil War groups, never had dealings with an organization that rolled out the red carpet for its visitors like this group does. We're going to talk about, as the slide says, Frank Lembo and the fight across Europe with Patton's Third Army. I love this postcard. Frank, our project. The book was published by Savas Beatty in 2020. It's been a project for probably at least 15 years before that. We're not really sure. In some senses, Lois started on it probably when she was a kid. Frank Lembo did not really talk much about. He told a few sort of funny thing happened, the office type stories. We knew the outlines of his career. He didn't make a secret of it. We knew these letters existed. The project is based, as you can see, it's written at several different levels. He wrote his fiancée more than 500 letters while he was in the Army, exactly 86 of them while he was in Europe. So the book starts with a foundation of his personal experiences and observations. It proceeds one level up from that, engineering records, what the engineers are doing, but then layered above that, it's nice the engineers built that bridge. What was going on that made that bridge necessary? What the affairs of the 80th Division were, and then for just a little bit of spice, some of the Patton, Monty, Ike stuff, the machinations of higher headquarters. And as I said, there is a prequel in preparation. These are the 2 main characters. Most of the war, Frank was a sergeant, commanded a squad. Late in the war, he was promoted to 2nd lieutenant and had a platoon. He left the Army as a 1st lieutenant. There are no letters written by Betty Craig that survive, but her personality comes through vividly in the letters Frank wrote, the sort of, gee, honey, I'm sorry I don't appear loving enough, or, things like that. They had had an on and off relationship since high school. Frank was more certain they belonged together than Betty. They had gotten engaged toward the end of Frank's training, Thanksgiving '43. They lived in Hawthorne, New Jersey. A word on engineers. The Army of the Civil War and the Army of World War I and the Army of 1930, in effect, moved at the pace of a marching GI. The engineering challenge moved at that pace as well. You know, the full mechanization, the German Blitzkrieg, adapted by us, was a very recent thing. The Army was learning what combat engineers needed to do as it went. But basically, a mechanized World War II Army doesn't leave camp without engineers. The 305th, the unit Frank served in, was the divisional engineers. They were organic to the 80th Division. They worked mostly with the 3 infantry regiments in the division. They did the assault crossings of the rivers. They blew the bridges if the Germans were coming, etc. Other engineers did the paving roads, building the permanent bridges, things like that. I did a very unscientific survey of the company diary that Frank served in, just counting the number of times a given task was mentioned. Overwhelmingly, their most common task was clearing mines and other obstacles. Second, roads, building them, repairing them, filling craters, removing dead animals, etc. Third, reconnaissance, often behind enemy lines. Fourth, although their engineers are known as bridge builders, this sounds silly, but you only build a bridge when you have a river. You clear mines every step of the way. So bridge building is fourth, fighting as infantry was fifth. Many other tasks. Ferrying, this is Nuremberg, that is a 305th engineer clearing streets. These are also 305th engineers building this is one of the 2 bread and butter bridges they built, the Treadway, across the Inn River from Germany into Austria. This you can tell they are not facing, this is late in the war when they're not, the soldiers vamping for the photographer, they're not under heavy fire. This is about 3 days before VE Day. A word on the Bailey Bridge. This was invented in 1941. This was a brand new tool invented by a British civil servant named Bailey. Modular design. I call it the Sherman tank of bridges. It's easy to produce, easy to maintain, easy to put up. No specialized tools. It's assembled by hand with nothing more complicated than hammers and monkey wrenches. That shows, the one on the upper right shows it's literally deployed by hand. You just get a bunch of guys and shove. The bottom right shows a medieval bridge with a Bailey bridge length, bridging the gap. The full length photo, the one on the left, shows barges holding up the bridge. A word on the division and training. The Army did not train soldiers, they trained divisions. The division in World War II was triangular, 3 by 3 by 3. This was a change in evolution. The change just happened a few years earlier. They were built for offense, for maneuver. They represented a tactical philosophy, whether it's a platoon, whether it's a regiment, a battalion, one to fix the enemy, one to take them in the flank, one to clean up. The fighting force of a 14,253-man division was the 2,916 riflemen in 243 squads. They took 90% of the casualties. If you read a division took 30% casualties, all that's left is the engineers, the quartermasters. Their fighting power's gone. The division also had 4 artillery battalions, integral to the vision, engineers, quartermasters, signal, etc. Armor was external. The 80th trained at Camp Forest in Tennessee. That upper right photo I love. It shows them how to float a Jeep across a lake. A PX in the field. I'm not going to get good service from my pointer. The upper left is building a bridge across the Cumberland River, machine gun training. The training, individual training, how to be a soldier, how to salute, hygiene, rules of combat, who you have to salute, protocol. Small unit training, how to build a bridge, if you're an engineer, how to build a bridge, how to blow a bridge up, use of demolitions, mine clearing, etc. Unit training, how to work as a division. Finally, maneuvers, division on division combat. The 80th was ready to go in August 43, but they had nowhere to go. So they spent another 10 months in training. They were a very well-trained division. They spent their last bit of training at, it was originally called the Desert Training Center. If you envision a camp that starts in the outskirts of Pomona, California, and goes to the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, that's the Desert Training Center. It was created by Patton when they thought they might spend 3-4 years fighting in North Africa. It was created partly for desert training, partly on purpose to just teach soldiers really how to operate in really harsh conditions. It was a tent city. There were 12 tent cities, each of which could hold a division. Simultaneously trained 12 divisions there. But if you read this, it's literally, we crossed a mountain range, we dug foxholes, then we had to hike 40 miles, dug more foxholes, had to assault a position, and then we crossed another mountain range, etc. By the way, it was New Year's Eve. They deployed on the Queen Mary at the end of June 1944. Queen Mary could carry an entire division. The biggest trick of the crossing was getting the division loaded. They deployed from New York Harbor. No convoys for Queen Mary. Her orders were, when you're ready to go, just tug on your whistle and go. And it was a 5-day sprint across the Atlantic. They've docked at the Firth of Forth in Scotland, spent a fairly casual month in England, basically waiting their ticket to cross to France. A lot of mentions in the letters of English beer and English weather. Their first combat was the 80th Division was the liberation of Argentan. The Argentan Falaise Pocket was the last closing the resistance of the Germans in Normandy. Patton, this was the first time Schaeff didn't take Patton's resources, interfered with Patton's plans. Patton's attitude toward Argentan was, who needs a city? I want to go north and kill Germans. Bradley, concerned about, zones of combat, friendly fire, running into the Poles and the Canadians, ordered him not to go an inch north of Argentan. Instead, take the city. The two pictures are actually, if there's a wider perspective, it's evident. That's the same doorway here. These are soldiers of the 317th with a killed German tank. It's usually identified as soldiers of the 318th doing a little impromptu accordion concert. Once the pocket closed, the most glorious week of the war for the Third Army, the Germans just ran. This shows the route of basically the 80th Division, came ashore at Omaha Beach. This is across France. This is the week that resulted from closure of the Argentan Falaise pocket, 600 some miles in a week. That's the era of the Red Ball Express. That's the Gallop that, if you saw the Patton movie, my wife tells me, just because you saw it, don't think everybody saw it. But the episode of taking fuel away mentioned in the movie is right there at the end of this Gallop, when they're on the verge of crossing the Moselle River. In contrast to this week, this is the months of September, mid-September to mid-December, the Lorraine campaign. Then, of course, the Gallop north. Here's Wiltz. The Bulge up here, that would be this. Then spring 45, heading for Berlin. Then the order to go find the Alpine Redoubt, crossing into Austria. They finished the war a few miles into Austria. The chase, a week-long romp. Life is great. Frank wrote a letter, they're building a bridge, the civilians came and brought him 150 eggs. The photo is Patton crossing the Seine, standing up, of course, in the Jeep. General Eddy, the commander of the 12th Corps, which most of the war, 80th Division was in the 12th Corps horsing around with some French boys. As I said, they outran their supplies right on the verge of crossing the Moselle. Frank's letters don't talk a lot about the war. A lot of it is the greatest generation we remember as adults, the greatest generation that fought the war, remind ourselves, basically teenage boys, many of them away from home for the first time. The engineers also have access to all the TNT their heart desires. So especially during that first period, we had a rodeo in a field. Everybody's kind of just horsing around. It's great. Life is great. We're living in buildings. Somebody slaughtered a hog. We've been having tenderloin and bacon cakes, and it's really been great. Hungry for fish last night. Boys took a couple blocks of TNT down the river. We had all the fish we needed. This is some boys from the 305th in a recently liberated French town. Now, eventually, though, there are rivers, you got to cross them. During that retreat, most of them, there were no Germans on the other side, but eventually you reach the point there are Germans on the other side. This lists the major contested assault crossings they had during the war. The toughest ones were probably the Moselle and the Sauer. Many of the assault boats were rubber floats. There was also the M2 engineer boat. These boats, 3 engineers, 14 soldiers, very scientific in theory, not necessarily in practice. You'd kind of wind up with these mixed loads of whoever jumped on the boat, come back for the next load. Simultaneously, another platoon starts trying to put in bridges. These guys, again, they're quick and dirty, something that allows tanks to cross. Again, Baileys and treadways for the most part. Their first real serious contested crossing the Moselle. Patton's had his fuel taken away. He's still convinced I can be in Berlin in 10 days. When he gets his fuel back, don't waste time doing reconnaissance. There's no Germans over there. They're still running. Don't wait for dark. No need. Just go, go, go. Well, it turned out they had reconstituted. They were still kind of a shadow themselves, but they're a real fighting force. They were still ready to fight. Using the clinical term they use at West Point, they got plastered when they crossed the Moselle the first time on September 5th. The 317th bore the brunt of the attack and really got hit hard. A week later, a somewhat more methodical attack 10 miles further south at Dillard. Still strong resistance, got across, savage fight for the hills over the next week. This was fun. This bridge is at Dillard, right at the point where we calculated they did their crossing. I don't know French, but I can read well enough to tell you that that sign says this bridge was destroyed in September 1944 and rebuilt in August 1953. I'm sure the boys of the 305th Engineers would have been happy to find that bridge intact. Frank gave one of his best descriptions of the engineering, worked from 10 at night to 10. On the opposite hill was, on our side, was all you could wish for. What he's referring to is a 1,000-yard line, 1,000-yard long line, easy to say, of machine guns. As he says, 1,000 yards, machine gun laid down fire, which turned everything to a red glare. Artillery did its share, and it just can't be described. The engineers walked across the open field carrying equipment with bullets flying hour by hour. Morning came. Frank observed, the infantry was hiding behind stone walls when we went out to build bridges. It's funny how the war works. Frank, his letters were mostly upbeat, but he did occasionally let his guard down, frustration with the war. We fight yard by yard, and then we fight to hold the yard. I don't know if this war is ever going to end. 2 days after the division's bloodiest day of the war, last few days, lost some good friends, hurts deep. No sense thinking about it. May the dead rest in peace. The pause at the verge of the Moselle, which lasted about 3 days, is the best known of the logistics pauses Patton had. But at the end of September, he had his fuel taken away for 6 weeks. From the last week of September until the 8th of November, Third Army fought exactly 1 day. This was, the first time was for Market Garden, the second time was to clear the port of Antwerp. During that time, 10 miles ahead of where they're stuck is the Selle River. Obviously, that's going to be your next objective when you get rolling again. The Selle River may have been the best scouted river crossing ever, because they just sent out patrols night after night after night. They knew where every machine gun was, every, command post, everything. One of those nights, Frank led a patrol. They ran into an ambush. Frank wound up with a Silver Star. The Army boilerplate, subject to severe enemy fire, force voluntarily remain exposed and have territory, etc. Frank's letter, of course, he chooses to treat it as kind of a laughing, went on a dumb luck, ran us right into a German outpost. Wasn't they threw a few, we didn't get our job done, no one was hurt. I'll tell you all about it after the war, actually rather humorous. I suspect the adrenaline still was a little bit high. We did discover, I mentioned this in the talk with the students, that was an overnight mission. Later that day, he went to see a USO show with Marlene Dietrich. I'm not sure if I had been through that, I'd have been calmed down enough to go see a USO show the same day, but this was Frank. The Selle, bad weather for a change worked in their favor. The Germans didn't believe anybody'd be out. Sort of like Washington's attack on Trenton, where the weather was so bad, the outposts had all been brought in and they made a sneak attack. This is a Bailey Bridge with a Sherman tank crossing it. Either this one or one collapsed into the river, and as Frank says, spent the next day working in a river getting a bridge out. He didn't swim. I was in the water for 8 hours and shook about 20 pounds off. I like his description. If you could see my truck going to the river, you'd have thought we were going on a picnic, about 20 men hanging on a rubber float, hanging on top, and rolling merrily along. Fairbursviller, this is the 3 yards in a cloud of dust, except it was mud, slog of the Lorraine campaign. This was no special note except that Jimmy Cannon wrote about it. He was later a well-known sports writer, but he wrote for Stars and Stripes during the war. Frank sent this letter home to Betty as this is what war's like. The dead hold Faribarsville now. Once the enemy did, and then we came, then they returned, and so did we. Today only the dead are there. The description in the upper left is from a memoir of an 80th Division soldier that I have, just describing, the nuts and bolts of infantry combat in World War II, fighting for the town that's today's objective. Pounding your way 50 miles, September, October, November, mid-December. 80th Division has orders December 18th to cross the Saar River into Germany. December 16th, Watch on the Rhine starts. Ike immediately sends out an order, let's hold everything till we've appraised the situation in the Ardennes and we know what's going on there. Patton quickly readjusts from, I'm ready to go into Germany and I'm going to be in Berlin in a week, to I'm ready to head up to Luxembourg and kill some Germans there. It's helpful to think of the Bulge as two separate battles. You got the North Flank, Malmedy, Stavelot, all of those places. That's First Army. They're completely separated by 4 German armies from the South Flank, which is Third Army, Bastogne, Edelbrook, and those places. Third Army is the only people in plausible position to attack the southern flank. They're 150 miles away, facing west, with no logistics, no maps, no nothing to help them get north. Patton says, of course, the famous remark, 80th Division is one of those 3 divisions. 305th is ahead of the convoy, clearing mines, clearing felled trees, etc. They did keep their words. They did attack in 72 hours. The 80th went into combat at Edelbrook, a town in very southwestern Luxembourg, a town that has a park in honor of Patton. Bastogne. Everybody knows the story of Bastogne. Upper right is a copy of Patton's weather prayer. He sent out a little, like a business card sized thing at Christmas time. On one side was a Christmas greeting to every soldier in Third Army. The other side was the weather prayer. Bastogne was important militarily, but what really made it important was when General McAuliffe said nuts. And all of a sudden now, my God, this is also symbolically crucial. We cannot abandon that brave general who said nuts to the Germans. So now if we didn't have to get there before, now we sort of double secret probation have to get there. Patton assigned 4th Armor the job. It's going slow. The garrison made some gentle digs. McAuliffe radioed, I was very disappointed I didn't get to shake hands with you today. In other words, you're not here, why not? And one of his staff officers radioed, a reminder, there's only one more shopping day left till Christmas. We were expecting you here Christmas. Where are you? Christmas Eve, they detached 2 battalions of the 318th to join that attack, and by happenstance, Frank's platoon was the engineering complement for that detachment. This map is a hand-drawn map. Now I'm confused, which is my functioning pointer. This is a hand-drawn map we found in a 2nd Battalion After Action report. Again, 3. So, of course, there's 3 columns. It's a triangular force, whether you're talking companies or battalions or whatever. The 3 different columns that were fighting their way into Bastogne. If you saw the D-Day segment of Band of Brothers, when Winters is assigned to take that artillery position, and he says, I wonder if they know how many men I've got, and we're gonna have to be pretty clever here. These guys were in that position because there were companies that were down to 25 men. I mean, they were severely under strength when they started and then spent 3 days in constant combat. So they had to be very clever about, like they'd bypass the town and then come at it from the rear, things like that. Frank's comment, the 27th, battle started, still going on, increasing fury. Somebody's going to have to give someday. I guess it's never going to be us. Soldier parochialism. If you've read a book about the Battle of the Bulge, you've read about Charles Bogus, and his column of tanks, Creighton Abrams's command, that blasted through the Assinois, linked up with that little fortress, broke the siege of Bastogne. 2 days later, the 318th 2nd Battalion fought their way into Bastogne. Their attitude toward who liberated Bastogne is expressed here in their after-action report. A couple tanks from 4th Armored worked their way into Bastogne and got trapped there. I love that comment, that what the history books say was symbolically at least the liberation of Bastogne. The attitude was, they got trapped there and we had to come rescue them. Mission accomplished. One advantage of, high casualties, the guy writing the after-action report, Riley, noted, as rations had been drawn for 350 men, there was ample food for all. Sour Crossing, the toughest fight of the war, the toughest crossing of the war, extreme floodwaters and the Siegfried line. This you get, a couple companies get across and nobody else gets across for 3 days. You read about this on Omaha Beach, you read about this at Mission, just a bunch of GIs getting together and saying, I don't like our odds fighting that fortress at the top of the hill, but I know what our odds are if we stay here, so let's go try. Hey, you got some demolitions, you got a machine gun, let's draw out a diagram and go do it. These guys just fought their way from the beach up, and their captain comes across 3 days later hoping some guys are still alive and finds them sitting inside the Siegfried Line fortress smoking cigarettes and drinking confiscated cognac. The Germans lost a lot of fight when the Siegfried Line fell. There was still some fighting, but more now the armor's in front and they're just chasing. Germans are increasingly looking for Americans to surrender to. The Rhine crossing was partly contested, but mainly not. A lot of 80th Division were just passengers in Higgins boats riding across the river and getting out on the other side. This is a convoy on the Autobahn. That's one way to get a tank across a river when you haven't built a bridge yet. Just a treadway float. Ohrdruf, first Western concentration camp, liberated by 4th Armored. Famously, this is the one when Ike came here, he said, I want you to open every door. I want to look in every attic. I want to see everything in this place because someday people are going to say, this didn't happen, and I'm going to tell them this happened. And he ordered every component of Allied armies anywhere near a camp to send a representative delegation to tour the camp for the same purpose. This is Ike, Bradley, Patton touring Ohrdruf. Nuremberg is kaput. That was the summary of the B Company, the guy who wrote the B Company diary. The bombers have been at it and they did a good job. Entering Austria, the rumors of the Alpine Redoubt, this supposed last stand of the SS, which nobody really believed, but George, go check it out just in case. Plus, somebody's got to link up with the Russians. Treadway Bridge across the Inn. Hitler's birthplace in Braunau. This is a U.S.-Russia checkpoint on the Enns River. I think the photographer is in Russian territory looking back. BE Day, 317th fired the last shots in the ETO. They were sent out on a mission. The German general gets a little queasy about whether he's going to surrender. The regiment commander says, well, don't take a lot of time thinking because my regiment's going to attack your 25,000 men tomorrow morning. German general opted to surrender. Mad scramble the day the ceasefire is announced of German soldiers to get across the Enns River so they can surrender to Americans. Occupation, a lot of it is fun. You've still got mines to clear. The new job now for engineers is displaced persons. You have former POWs of every country in the world. You have concentration camp inmates. You have common criminals. You have deserters from every army in the world. You've got SS guards trying to blend in. You've got just German civilians who have been bombed. They're all milling around, getting sick and starving, and a massive security issue. You've got to corral them. You've got to separate the wolves from the sheep. And the sheep, you want to get them back to health and get them home. You know, these slave laborers from France aren't doing anybody any good here in Austria. The diary makes references to Sergeant so-and-so drew rations for 2 weeks and took a convoy of 6 trucks of DPs to Netherlands. You know, that was a big part of their job for the month or so after the war ended. Frank operated a railroad for a few weeks, just doing local transportation. But there's also time for fun. This is a Billy Rose show at the Winter Olympic Stadium in Garmisch. Epilogue. He returned home. He had an offer of a career in the Army. He went home, he told Betty, okay, Betty, you know, time to stop, you know, playing coy. We're either getting married or I'm going to go back and rejoin the Army and go to Japan. Betty says, Frank, of course, don't be so silly, I'll get married. He left the Army, he took his uniform off and hung it in the closet. And as far as he was concerned, that was the end of World War II. He enjoyed his time in the Army. He considered it some of the proudest accomplishments of his life, but it was done. He didn't stay in touch with his Army buddies or anything. He went to work for his father's construction company, eventually became public works director of his hometown. And their love story continued for nearly 60 years. He died about 2 weeks short of their 60th anniversary. And that's the end of the story. And I thank you all very much for your attention.
Don asked me to talk for a few minutes on the other kind of combat engineers in Third Army. When I taught at St. Thomas, I met a man who had served as a platoon leader and then company commander of Company B of the 113rd Engineer General Service Regiment. And I'm going to talk about that regiment and about Earl, whose wife is with us tonight. Carol, where are you? Engineer General Service Regiments, as I noted in the program notes, the round tablet, were meant to build stuff in the base area, England, or the continental U.S., or in the communications zone, and that's on the backside of your round tablet, that combat zone, or combat theater, or at the worst, into the intermediate zone, but they shouldn't get any further forward. Unlike combat engineers in battalions who are supposed to be up at the tip of the spear, These guys were supposed to be on the shaft of the spear and pretty far down. Yet by 1943, the Army realized that it was running short of engineer combat battalions, and Third Army was going to be really short. And so they took 3 engineer general service regiments and turned them into combat engineers. As Leon noted, the engineer combat battalions were owned by the division. They were an integral part. These 3 general service regiments were owned by Third Army. They were assigned to Third Army and attached to 12th Corps and the other corps. The 13th Third was assigned, or attached rather, to 12th Corps, Patton Eddy's Corps. And of course, this is a regiment of 6 companies plus the headquarters company, divided into 2 battalions. And each battalion was basically assisted a division in the Corps at 1 company per. Company B, which is the company that Earl served in, I thought it was interesting. Frank was in Company B of the 305th. We didn't plan this. If you look at the side stripe here, this, see which end works. Yeah, there we are. This group here, the 1st Battalion, it would have companies A, B, and C. That's about the size of an engineer combat battalion. Unfortunately, of course, the Army, in its wisdom, had some very strange practices. As the cadre arrived at Camp Ellis and began receiving new soldiers to the unit, they were organized by height. So Company A was the tallest, Company F were the shortest. If you run across the picture, and I think I might have it in the Patton's Fighting Bridge Builders, Company F was called the Mighty Midgets, and they built one of those bridges that Patton used to cross the Rhine. And so there's some very nice photos of that bridge in Patton. During training, other units dumped unwanted men, often senior sergeants who weren't really very good in wartime, on the 13th Third, and they had to get rid of them somehow. Unfortunately, of course, this continual inflow of men meant that training was always interrupted. Earl, my friend who started out at Texas A&M, graduating in January of 1943 as an engineer, was offered the chance to wait until being drafted or enlist in the Army and go to OCS. And so he enlisted, was given a corporal's stripes, made a drill instructor, and 6 weeks later got sent to OCS and Engineer Officer School at Fort Belvoir. The cadre came from Fort Belvoir after division officer course. It later became something else, but it wasn't effective enough for what they were going to do. Typical Army training, train for the last war or the next war, but not this war. The training Earl commented on included a lot of building their own exercise, the obstacle courses and the like, completing buildings, learning all those construction trades. One of the interesting things, for example, the company commander, initially first lieutenant, later captain, Manuel Gonzalez, whose father was a Navy admiral, he's from Florida. Gonzalez owned his own construction company, and every one of the company commanders, first company commanders in the 13th Third, had been in the construction business. either owner or manager of construction, with the knowledge to get their hands dirty. And a goodly number of the cadre were engineers by Army training. So they trained at Camp Ellis, but they're supposed to build things. Does this look like they're building things? Doesn't this look like what Leon was showing us? They were trained not only to be general service regiment types, but to be combat types. This is Captain Gonzalez, and there were 4 officers under him in the company, 3 platoon leaders and the executive officer, Casey DeVicus, who was not an engineer, and I think the only experience he had with a hammer and a saw was in his parents' basement or garage. Nonetheless, he was an excellent administrator. 13th Third trained at Camp Ellis and then went to Boston and took ship to the Firth of Forth, rode a nice little train down into England where they spent 3 months building airstrips, sand tables for the paratroopers. If you did that, of course, you got locked on the airbase until they left. Some of them got other assignments. Earl officially was sent to assist in assembling maps for the invasion force. He said it involved floating around in small craft off Normandy at H-3 or so, blowing obstacles. And as usual, the Navy didn't get them to the right set of obstacles, but they figured there were obstacles, they blew them. Got on their boat and went back home to England. Meanwhile, the landing force came in and had fewer obstacles to run into. At the end of July, the 13th Third went to France and came ashore at Utah Beach. Everybody came ashore at Utah Beach. It's actually right over there. And then began their movement first west and then south, going along the Atlantic coast, down this way, through Coutances, Avranches, and while they were doing that, the Germans launched Operation Lüttich, the Mortain offensive, to try and drive a wedge through this column. They still didn't know it was Third Army, let alone Patton's. The deception that Patton was in England commanding the fictional First Army Group held. And fortunately, it failed. And that is their route through France. And here's their detour to Bastogne, and then off into Germany down to Passau on the German-Austrian border. Earl mentioned the movement to Bastogne was done under verbal orders. Patton's G2, Colonel Koch, was not focused directly on the area in front of Third Army. He kept an eye on everything north and south of them. And so he was not at all surprised, and Patton was not surprised at the German offensive. And Patton had at least workable plans out of his G3 shop for a movement northward if needed. And so when he was given permission after his boastful, "I can be there in a hurry," to do it, it was verbal orders. Earl said they got a list of times, and you're supposed to hit this intersection at this time because this cross traffic will be cleared. You have to clear that intersection by this time because there's cross traffic that's going to enter that intersection seconds later. And if you're late, pull off to the side of the road, get out of the way, and wait till the end of your column comes through, which might be several hours or several days. So they're demudding the roads that everybody ahead of them has torn up. It started as soon as they got to France. Was they're moving down the coastline from Coutances to Avranches. 2nd French Armor, the Leclerc's division, was with them. And of course, they were all going by Grand-Mère's house. So you'd see a tank come zipping along, pull off, hop, everybody'd hop out, go have a few calvados, hop back in. Now they're a little tipsy, roar back down the road till they run into the next relative and the next bottle of calvados. Well, that tears up the road, so you've got to put it back together. Sometimes you use a D7, sometimes you use shovels. That's a Bill Maudlin cartoon from Italy. Same job, different area, and same response. The officer is hollering back, "Damn fine road, men." Made him feel good. All the bridges they built had to be planned. Unlike the combat engineers in the 305th, who didn't have to worry about a plan, they just assembled the pieces across the river. These guys came in and had to build the bridge. And so they had plans. And both regiment and battalion had planning, drafting staffs who planned these bridges for them. This is not to scale. If you count up, one section is 41 feet, the next one is 38, and the next two are 29, but they all look the same. This is a real workable plan, isn't it? This is one of those rivers, this is in Kilburg in Germany, that's in flood stage. You'll notice there's a bailey and traffic is going across. Meanwhile, they're building piers filled with rubble, based on rubble, and they're starting to build under the bailey. What you don't want to do is pull that bailey out and interrupt traffic for 3 or 4 days. So you've got to minimize the disruption. These guys, and I don't know how widespread this practice was, but Company B did it every bridge, basically. That's Earl standing in the middle of the river. I hope he knew how to swim at that time. Here's the same bridge completed, and you'll notice J. Weber, Gasthaus J. Weber, which was the one in the previous photo. So that's what the bridge looked like after they were done with it. Here you see a bridge at Glenhausen, the bailey, and then the bridge underneath on timber trestles. They're going to have to punch through this area here without disturbing the bailey. Here's a better picture of how they did it. They're laying the decking on top of the bridge under the bailey. Once they get that in there, they'll pull that bailey out and lay down the finished decking, the curbing, and then open it to traffic. Minimal disruption. And here again is another one of their bridges. I'm not sure which bridge this is right offhand. I just was going through my files, grabbing things that looked good for what I wanted to do. This is a rather significant one. In the write-up, I commented that the 764th Dump Truck Company, which gave them their lift, they didn't have enough trucks to move their equipment, let alone the men, in either a company or the regiment. And so a section of that dump truck company was assigned to each company in the regiment. They're black. And you'll notice he's black. When they first joined the 1303rd, Company B, the sergeant in command of the section found First Sergeant Dowds and asked where Dowds wanted them to camp and added that his guys would come in at the end of the mess line if they were able to get food from the company mess. Dowds said, no, we'll have none of that. There's some spots here in the tenting area. Put your tents there. When you come in, your guys get in line as they come in, not waiting till the end. Well, Dowds was a Southerner. Earl's from Texas. He'd been at oil field roustabout during college. Gonzalez is from Florida. Anybody suspect that they might be just a little bit upset about this integration of a segregated army? And some were. And Dowds took them out behind the tents, took off his shirt, and explained the realities to them. And after that, there were no further problems with that group. But it's unusual enough that it's worth noting, because this is the exception, not the rule. In Passau, at war's end, the regiment had a nice little party. The men had their own. The officers had a little bit more sober and refined. In other words, less fun. There were people from Corps and Third Army as well, from their staffs at this thing. From Passau, they went to Marseille to Camp Lucky Strike. Most units, combat units, heading back to the United States to go to the Pacific, remember the Japanese weren't done yet, went by ship to New York, Boston, an East Coast port, got leave in transit, and then reported usually at San Francisco or a base near San Francisco for the voyage across the Pacific. Oh no, not the 13th Third, not the 13th First, or the 13th Sixth. Those three were taken away from Third Army, put on a fast ship because they had to go through the Panama Canal in a hurry. They were to assist First Marine Division in the Olympic landings. They were all three went into camp near Nichols Field, an air base just south of Manila, and left for Japan from the port of Manila. They sailed to the Pacific on the USS General John Pope, an Army fast transport. They blasted through the Panama Canal, high priority passage. It took them a month to get from Europe to the Pacific, which was very good timing. Camped at Nichols Fields on the 15th of August, 1945, a Wednesday. The company diary, actually it's a morning report, noted, "The end of the war with Japan was announced this morning. Everyone feels elated. We are slated for Japan." But of course they'd been slated for Japan, but now they knew they were going there. And they departed Manila on the USS LST 798 at the end of August, anchoring in Yokohama Bay on the 12th of September. Not long after Japanese surrender. They became the headquarters unit, construction unit for General Headquarters. There's Earl, and by now just 3 platoon leaders. And of course, as things shrunk, it became 2 platoons. And the roll regiment, Earl went home in November. All of the high point men got out October, November, early December. The low point men got out by the end of January. It was the new recruits who were around long enough to be deactivated on the 31st of January. What I found interesting was that the current 130th Engineer Brigade carries their lineage and honors. That's highly unusual. A general service regiment, lineage and honors being carried by a combat brigade. So, with that, our presentations are done, and we'll turn to, I guess, a Q&A.
Censorship on Frank's letters. Was there any censorship?
Was there any censorship?
Every letter Frank sent had the mark of a censor. It was his When he was a squad, it was platoon leaders for the most part who did the censoring. His platoon commander was Lieutenant Henke, and they all had the marks. Frank either knew the rules, I suspect it was that, or was given the letters back to rewrite. There were no censoring marks in any of the letters. They had all been cleared by Lieutenant Henke. I think Frank was disciplined enough to know what he couldn't mention. He made many comments, like his first day with the armor on the way to Bastogne. He said, "We had really interesting experiences the last couple of days. I just can't talk about them. I'll tell you after the war." You read that a lot in his letters. And then when he became a platoon commander, he got to censor letters himself.
Lois, I'm going to ask you a question. If you'd pull the mic up over there. Frank had one son and two daughters.
That's correct.
Tell us about how his children reacted to Frank's story and why you became interested in your father's.
Could you repeat the question?
How did the three kids react to Frank's story, and how did you become interested in?
Frank never talked about the war, and we were born, at least I was born in 1950, and by then the war had been over forever, as if. So I don't know that as kids we adjusted. You know, we were children of the 50s and went on with our way, but as time went on, I became increasingly interested in my father's experience, and he had brought back some mementos, including the company diary that talked about where he was and pretty much what he was doing on every day. And I just began to think about those things as treasures, and they really were treasures, and they opened up the world of his experiences to me. And my sister and brother were interested, but not as much consumed by it as I eventually became.
Well,
Betty had kept faithfully a scrapbook of clippings from the newspaper, any mention of 3rd Army, 80th Division, which the New York Daily News in particular, that was the paper she seemed to read, reported in detail on what the divisions were doing. He also sent home the GI postcards that interspersed through the presentation. He sent those home. He sent a lot of memorabilia home besides the letters themselves.
I didn't even discover the letters until many years later, or many years into the project. I knew that they were there. My father would talk about how they were in the rafters, but he never would get them down for me. So it wasn't until my niece bought my father's house several years later, and she went into the rafters when she did some remodeling. And sure enough, as promised.
and the reason that's important to me, when you see my comments in the Fox Patriot Award, I hope that everyone in the audience will find something of their family. It doesn't have to be World War II. It could be Korea. If you look in the paper, we're losing so many of the Korean and even Vietnam veterans today. But it's a matter of linkage of families. And I think it's so important for all of us to realize we're not just here today, that we stand on the shoulders of others, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and trying to find out who they are, what they did, what they experienced. I think you'll find value in that.
That was definitely part of my experience, that I lived with my parents for the whole time that I was working on this project, and that was for a decade, more than a decade. And I came to know them as young people, which I had never had dreamed of before. But Frank and Betty became my next door neighbors. It was wonderful.
Any other questions over there? Any questions on this aisle? Chris, here's a question. Oh, here you go.
Question for Leon. Leon, Frank earned the Silver Star, and that's a big deal. And where is that Silver Star medal now? And do you have his uniforms, or is that lost to history?
My brother has a silver star.
Yeah, Betty, interestingly, Betty at one point had a shadow box made, mounted in a little frame for the Silver Star. And Frank's attitude was, why'd you do that? He didn't just, it wasn't an unpleasant memory in any way at all. He spoke fondly of his time in the Army, but it was done. Lois, in my presence, at least 5 different times, tried to get him to talk about the Silver Star mission. Most of the time, he just said, it's nothing. Once he got a little misty-eyed and he said, I don't want to talk about it. He did at one point say to the kids, hey, look, I went through some pretty rough experiences in large part, so you wouldn't have to. Why would I want to take you there? He had 3 dear friends from the beginning of training, Scotty, Whitey, and Eddie. Scotty in particular is mentioned in practically every letter. When they were at Camp Kilmer waiting to deploy, they double dated a couple times. Never saw him again, as far as we know. Once, they basically shook hands and said, it was great knowing you, have a good life. Didn't stay in touch with his buddies, no interest in Veterans Affairs activities at all. I think it was just, that was an important part of my life, but now I'm building a family, and that's my life now.
The true citizen soldier, if I can say it that way.
Cincinnatus. Did my duty, now I'm gonna.
Well, listen, if there's no other questions, another question here? Okay, yeah.
He came home to our hometown. He worked in his father's business, the construction company, for many years, and it started out being Joseph Lembo, general contractor, and then it became Lembo and Son, general contractor, and then it was my father's business for many years. And then later on, he became the public works director at our town. So he continued on in his engineering.
And let me just add a note here. Joe, you can help me with this. But Earl Hall came back, worked for GE, as I
Worked
recall.
for GE.
Yeah.
And then got a doctorate in economics and sociology from the New School for Social Research. He also went to seminary with a guy named Martin Luther King Jr. and became a minister and did march with Martin from Selma. Very proud of, I think he was prouder of that than most of his war career. Was a business school dean, retired from that, one of those jobs, and came to St. Thomas to be the director of our management center. And that's where I met him, having coffee on a nearly daily basis of an afternoon. So
Well, listen, let's break it. If you folks can help Lois get up, we want you guys upstairs to sign some books.
Okay.
Okay.
So if both of you can get up there, Doug, you'll help them with that. I do want to make one announcement. Next month, the program is going to be on the Faustian story of how Stalin helped build Hitler's army.
Support for this program is provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org.